All right, welcome everybody. It is Friday, October 3rd. This is the Florida EMS Webinar, part of the Florida chapter of the NAMSP. We've been doing this now for many years, and we have hundreds and hundreds of amazing speakers. And along the way, we've found even a co-host. And today we're going to have Tanner Smida, who is one of our co-hosts here on the webinar, who is a prolific researcher who just published another paper in resuscitation with a great group of authors, including Dr. Sheldon Chesky's, Dr. Remley Crow, and many others. And he's going to be talking about something that is quite interesting with respect to the initial defibrillation dose and outcomes from adult out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. So without any further ado, Tanner, welcome to the webinar as our speaker. My friend, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back in the saddle. We actually managed to publish two papers related to the care of shockable out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in this issue. One comparing amiodarone and lidocaine, and then the paper we're talking about today looking at the influence of initial defibrillation dose on outcomes following cardiac arrest. So this is published again, like Dr. Antebi said, in the Journal of Resuscitation in the January of this year. So jumping right into it, right, as it stands now, resuscitation guidelines from the American Heart Association and the European Resuscitation Council and ILCOR, they essentially say that it's acceptable with your initial defibrillation to start anywhere with a biphasic defibrillator between 120 and 360 joules. And they further say that you should follow the manufacturer recommendation of the monitor defibrillator that you're using, or if you don't know what the recommendation is, just go with the maximum starting dose, right? However, the science underlying the optimal initial defibrillation energy is pretty sparse, right? Underlying both the recommendation that I just read out from these international resuscitation organizations, as well as the recommendations that are out there for pediatric cardiac arrest patients, right? That start at 2 joules per kilogram and goes to 4. There's really not a lot of evidence underlying that practice pattern. And we felt it was a reasonable thing to study because this really is a modifiable factor, right? When we're performing manual defibrillation, we select the starting energy, right? So we felt this was kind of a decision point that's worth studying. But before our study, to our knowledge, it had never been addressed before in a large multi-center study in the out-of-hospital setting. And so using my favorite pre-hospital data set, the ESO Data Collaborative, we aim to estimate the association between initial defibrillation dose and outcomes, including ROSC and survival to hospital discharge. So for those of you that don't know, right, ESO is essentially a software company. They provide electronic health record software to thousands of EMS agencies across the United States and more recently now in Canada. And so essentially, right, all the data that EMS clinicians put into their electronic health record, data on demographics, assessment findings, treatments, the timing of these treatments, that all gets included in these records. And then on an annual basis, ESO essentially de-identifies all this data and packages the data into annual data sets that can then be used free of charge by EMS researchers like our team. And so in terms of our inclusion criteria, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more specifically when we go through our flow diagram in the first slide of our results section, we kept a couple things in mind. So when we were designing the inclusion criteria for this study, we targeted a population that we would want to include in a randomized clinical trial. And so I mean by this, in all of emergency medicine and critical care, we run into kind of the eternal problem. There are 3 populations of patients that we have to deal with when conducting clinical trials. So we have one group of patients that are essentially very healthy, right? And no matter what we do, they're probably going to have a good outcome, and the interventions that we provide are probably not going to have a big influence on how they do, right? So in the context of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, this might be like the witness VF who gets shocked immediately and wakes up, right? All of our experimental interventions, they probably don't influence that patient's outcome very much. They're going to do well. Conversely, there's another population of patients out there that are just so sick that no matter what we do, nothing's going to work, right? The 90-year-old with asystole in a nursing home, right? We can enroll, as many patients fitting that profile in randomized controlled trials as we want, and they're never going to have a good outcome, right? And then we have a population kind of in the middle, right, where they're kind of on a knife's edge, and our interventions can push them one way or the other, right? And that's the population we really want to focus on, right? And so we tailored our criteria to try to focus on that population, the patients who we really want to save, right? And then additionally, with our inclusion criteria, we took pains to ensure temporality between our exposure and our outcome. And what I mean by that is we made sure that all patients who had ROSC prior to the first defibrillation attempt were excluded from our analyses, right? So the patients who had maybe a non-shockable initial arrest were resuscitated and then experienced a shockable rearrest. We excluded those patients because, for internal validity's sake, an exposure, in this case, defibrillation dose, can't cause an outcome if that outcome's already occurred, right? Again, I've said this a couple times, our exposure was defibrillation dose, which we defined as joules per kilogram. Our primary outcome was ROSC. That was available for all the patients in the ESO dataset. And then as a secondary outcome, we assessed survival to hospital discharge. Survival to hospital discharge, which we derived from hospital disposition data, that's available for about 20% of transported patients in the ESO data collaborative. So much smaller sample size for that outcome. In terms of our statistical modeling strategy, we utilized multivariable logistic regression. And kind of a design highlight was we used something called a directed acyclic graph to pick the variables that we included in our multivariable logistic regression. So I want to take a couple minutes to talk about this. So normally the kind of template that cardiac arrest research follows, right, is we pick an exposure, we pick a medication or an intervention, an airway, we pick an outcome. And then in a statistical model, we include what we call, right, the Utstein factors, all the factors that we know predict outcome following cardiac arrest, demographics like age and sex and bystander CPR and witness status, and we put all those in the model, and then we look to see what association gets spit out, right? But the problem is, if you adjust for the wrong variables, there is the possibility that we will create self-inflicted biases, right? So we can accidentally adjust for variables that are called mediators or colliders, and that can skew the relationship between exposures and outcomes. So kind of put quite simply, a directed acyclic graph is essentially a way to create a visual graph that displays how we understand the relationships between exposure and outcome, confounders, mediators, and colliders, right? And essentially put on paper how we conceptualize kind of the causal relationships between all of the variables that we measure in relation to cardiac arrest. To give you an example of why this is really important. So, and this is actually something I've been thinking about. I submitted a project proposal to look at this in the future, which is why I kind of have these slides ready. Let's think about the association between dispatch recognition of cardiac arrest and survival, right? So, and we think that this is important, right? Dispatch recognition of cardiac arrest may improve survival through dispatch of appropriate resources in a timely way, initiation of telecommunicator CPR, right? This first link in the chain of survival, we think it's important. And so kind of if we did this kind of the standard way, right? And we said, okay, we're gonna stratify our cardiac arrest patients into the ones that were identified at dispatch versus not. We're going to look at the association between survival, and we're going to adjust for all the Utstein factors, right? Early bystander AED use and bystander CPR and response time and all those things, right? However, that would be incorrect to do, right? In this analysis, it would be from a methodologic perspective, inappropriate to adjust for AED use, bystander CPR, and response time. And if you adjusted for these things, if you included them in your statistical model, your estimate of effect size would be wrong, right? And the reason for this is, right, these variables are not confounders in this relationship. They're actually mediators, right? They sit along the causal path between the exposure, dispatch recognition of cardiac arrest, and outcome, right? So if you adjust for CPR prior to EMS arrival, if you adjust for response time, if you adjust for early defibrillation, you're essentially adjusting away all of these causal paths that really explain the way that dispatch recognition impacts cardiac arrest survival. So if you threw all the Utstein factors in a model, you would incorrectly conclude that dispatch recognition doesn't matter and we probably shouldn't be worrying about that, right? But that's wrong, and that's really a harmful conclusion. So it's not really important that you understand all the underlying relationships here, but essentially we diagrammed all of our kind of causal inferences here, and this directed acyclic graph essentially tells us that at a minimum, we need to adjust for weight to address bias from confounding when trying to answer this question, right? And so throughout the rest of our analyses, you'll see that in our analyses, we've both performed DAG-guided adjustment, which says that you can address for bias from all of these different factors by adjusting for weight alone. And then we also used a maximally adjusted model that, in addition to weight, we added a bunch of other factors that predict outcome following cardiac arrest. And importantly, we made sure when we're putting together this list that we didn't inappropriately include any mediators or colliders in our analysis. So just a methodological point there and a little basic explanation of why epidemiologists say you should use directed acyclic graphs. Another methodologic point, right? So before we get to the results, after we had sort of done this analysis, and as Dr. Antebi mentioned, Dr. Sheldon Cheskes was a collaborator on this paper who knows more about defibrillation than almost anybody in the world, right? He pointed out an important limitation of our analyses, which was, you know, the different monitors that are used may be important in defibrillation success. Because the different commercially available monitors, so the LifePak and the Zoll X series are really the two most common monitors that were used in the United States during the study period. In addition to having kind of different energy levels that you're able to select, they actually deliver defibrillation using different biphasic waveforms, right? So you have the LifePak here that delivers a biphasic truncated exponential waveform, and then you have the Zoll that delivers a rectilinear biphasic waveform. And so, as an additional layer of our analysis, we actually went to the ESO engineering team, and they were able to look at the subset of patients who had monitor files uploaded to their electronic health records. And based on the file suffixes, they were able to tell whether patients were treated with a biphasic truncated exponential waveform or a rectilinear biphasic waveform, essentially by identifying which monitors were used to treat which patients, right? And so in addition to performing our directed acyclic guided analysis and our maximally adjusted analysis, we also performed stratified analyses looking at what cardiac monitors were used to treat these patients and what defibrillation waveforms. Okay, so ESO dataset, 2018 to 2023, we had access to the data from over 500,000 out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients. And so we applied some kind of standard exclusion criteria that we had to for this analysis, right? So obviously we excluded patients with non-shockable initial rhythms. We excluded patients who didn't have a defibrillation dose documented, right? Typically those are defibrillations with AEDs. And we excluded patients who had missing weight data. We also, so before I said, right, we're targeting that population that isn't futile, right? So we excluded patients who had likely poor baseline functional status, those patients who were in nursing homes or assisted living facilities at the time of their cardiac arrest. And we also excluded cardiac arrest patients who are greater than 80 years of age due to low survival and a high probability of having numerous comorbidities in that patient population. We also, so some other standard things, right? We excluded traumatic arrests. We excluded patients with resuscitation limiting advanced directives. So with those initial exclusion criteria, we ended up with a final sample of just over 20,000 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests eligible for our analyses of return of spontaneous circulation. And then of those, just under 3,000 patients had survival to hospital discharge data. Just to give you an idea of kind of the distribution of defibrillation energies, weights, and then our primary exposure, so joules per kilogram. Overall, across the sample, the median joules per kilogram delivered was a little over 2, so about 2.3 joules per kilogram was the median for the whole sample, and you can see it sort of approximates a normal distribution here with a bit of skew. So first going through some of just our unadjusted analyses, right? So this, we essentially just plotted the proportion of patients with ROSC against defibrillation dose. And you can see even from this unadjusted analysis, right, you can see that there's not much of a relationship across the distribution, right? Maybe a little less ROSC at the low end. However, you know, with these patients that have low joules per kilogram, there's a lot of obese patients down in this group, right, which might impact survival via independent mechanisms, right? And again, this is prior to any adjustment for weight. To give you an idea of what our cohort looked like, so it looks like a pretty standard population of patients with VF, so median age in the 60s. It took about 11 minutes from dispatch to the first defibrillation. Regardless of the monitor that was used, the median initial defibrillation energy was 200 joules. Like I said before, defibrillation dose is a median of 2.3 joules per kilogram. So about a majority of our patients were male, about over 60% were witnessed. Not surprisingly, right? Most had VF, most had a presumed cardiac etiology. Most occurred in private locations in homes, right, which reflects CARES data. In terms of interventions that were provided, the majority received AED use prior to the arrival of EMS. Now, the majority of this was fire department, first responder, law enforcement AEDs, right? A minority of these were actual true bystander AED deployments. Most patients had intraosseous access. Little under half received, as a first airway attempt, received an endotracheal intubation attempt. Little over 40% had ROSC. About 33% survived a discharge, which if you look at CARES data, that's about what, for initial VF, that's about what survival is in the United States. And then under 25% survived and went home, right? Which we use as a kind of a proxy for a good functional outcome at discharge. All right, so getting to our adjusted analyses, right? So overall, the story here is that there was no association between initial defibrillation dose and outcome. This was true for ROSC, this was true for survival to discharge, and this was true for survival and discharge to home. It was true when we looked at truncated exponential waveforms like the LifePak, It was true when we looked at rectilinear waveforms, right? Like the Zoll defibrillator waveforms. And it was true when we looked at everybody together, right? We see the exact same thing when we looked at the full multivariable model with that laundry list of things that predict outcome following cardiac arrest. We essentially see no heterogeneity, right? Odds ratio is very close to 1, fairly narrow confidence intervals that suggest there really isn't an effect of initial defibrillation dose. We also performed a number of sensitivity analyses, right? We were concerned that there would be a lot of bias from patients at the tails of the weight distribution. So at the high end of the weight distribution, you have patients who are extremely obese. That can really negatively impact survival, right? Maybe they have tougher airways to manage. Maybe they're harder to perform adequate CPR on. It's harder to extricate these patients, right? There are a number of things that could lead to bad outcomes. Similarly, on the low end of the scale, patients who have really low body weights among adults, these are patients that could have cachexia from cancer, from HIV/AIDS, from a number of other things, or maybe just general deconditioning, right? That could lead to bad outcomes, right? And so instead we said, okay, let's just look right at the center of the weight distribution, these patients who are between 90 and 110 kilos, and see if we can see an association in these patients with a relatively, normally distributed distribution of weights. No difference, right? Zoll, LifePak, all waveforms didn't seem to matter. AED use prior to EMS arrival might be important because, patients who are very easy to defibrillate might shock out before EMS gets there with an AED, right? And they might have ROSC when EMS gets there. So we looked at patients that had no AED use prior to arrival. So EMS was truly the first on scene. They were the first performing interventions. No difference, right? We also looked at waveform, at initial rhythms, right? So we looked at just VF and just VT. And we did see a singular statistically significant result. So among patients with ventricular tachycardia who are treated with a truncated exponential waveform, so if you're VTach treated with a LifePak, we found that higher initial defibrillation doses were associated with more ROSC, right? Now I will say this, right? Just based on the statistical methods we used, we would expect 1 in 20 hypothesis tests to be positive by random chance alone, right? We performed a lot more than 20. If you look at all each box, right, in this table is a different sensitivity analysis, right? In this paper, we performed a lot more sensitivity analyses than that. So it's very likely that this is just random noise, random variation in the data. Although, again, there is a possibility that there's some different physiology between VTach and VF and the interaction between that and different defibrillation waveforms that explains this difference. But I would interpret that with an extreme degree of caution, right? We also performed a maximally adjusted model, and then we added in the waveform type covariable for the subgroup of patients that had the monitor file data available. Once again, no difference, right? Odds ratios as close to 1 as you can get it, right? And because I know people are probably interested, right, we also did a kind of essentially Stryker-Zoll comparison. And so we compared the outcomes of patients treated with the BTE versus the rectilinear biphasic waveforms. No difference, right? The outcomes were identical, right? And so the main message from this paper for the things that we were interested in, right? We were interested in initial dose. We were interested in waveform. It was essentially null. Doesn't seem to matter what monitor you use. It doesn't seem to matter what your initial energy setting is, right? In relation to body weight, doesn't make a difference, right? Now, when we look at our statistical models, the number one thing that predicted outcome in these patients, right? Not just ROSC, survival to discharge, predicted outcome overall most strongly was time from dispatch to defibrillation. Right. So again, a lot of not really able to make any recommendations based on the data I've presented so far. At a clinician level, right, when you're dispatched to a cardiac arrest, the number one thing on your mind should be getting pads on the chest and getting a rhythm analysis and a shock on board, if indicated, right? From a system level, if you're a medical director, if you're a quality improvement person, if you want to improve cardiac arrest survival in your community, number one factor that you should be looking at is time to defibrillation, right? That's the number one thing that determines survival from VF. Again, this is a new finding. This is something new we've discovered, but it bears out in our statistical models, right? And I don't have a very weighty discussion today. I typically have pretty weighty discussions on our papers where we try to contextualize our findings and talk about, physiologic mechanisms that might link our findings to why we found a better outcome in one group or another. But first of all, there's not a lot of previous data out there. And second of all, we didn't find really a difference in any group that we can try to lean on other papers or physiology to explain. And so the only thing I want to contextualize is our findings that defibrillator manufacturer or defibrillation waveform doesn't matter. This has been looked at in one other nationwide cohort study. So in this study, they essentially had different regions serviced by different EMS systems that used different cardiac monitors, right? And so they did a LifePak versus old comparison. Similar to our analysis, they found no difference in outcomes, right? Now, a lot of limitations with this analysis, right? So first of all, start out with missing data, right? So about 20% plus of patients had missing weight data, right? Which might lead to some selection bias. You may also criticize, you may say, well, how do we know that those weights are accurate? I've seen, EMS clinicians dramatically overestimate or underestimate a patient's weight, or, they'll write 100 kilos in there just to justify the dose of lidocaine that they gave or whatever it is. There is data out there. So there's one or two papers out there that suggest that EMS clinicians are able to accurately estimate the weight of cardiac arrest patients within about 20% of their true weight, more than 80% of the time, right? And so that's what we threw to reviewers to say that, EMS clinicians are probably better at this than you think. On top of that, right, from a pragmatic perspective, if we were asking EMS clinicians to adjust the defibrillation dose that they were delivering based on their estimation of patient weight, this is still the most pragmatic way to answer that question, right? We used EMS documented weights to calculate our exposure. If we were going to ask people to modify that exposure, they would have to use EMS estimated weights to calculate it, right? In addition, right, for our survival analyses, right, we also have to deal with, selection bias there. Only transported patients had survival data, and it was only 20% of all transported patients, right? So that it may not be representative of the overall population, although we have previously shown that transported and non-transported patients in ESO, they really do have similar baseline characteristics. Now, another big limitation, right? So, although energy is what we select on cardiac monitors, and energy is what is talked about in guidelines, energy is actually not a great descriptor of what we're trying to do with defibrillation, right? We're not like really trying to deliver like energy to the heart, right? What we're really trying to do is we want current at the myocardium, right? That's what's thought to be the real predictor of defibrillation success is current density at the myocardium, right? And so in this study, we didn't have access to the waveform data that would allow us to calculate current, right? We would need like the transthoracic impedance values. And so that's really a big limitation, right? We're using energy to calculate our exposure. Energy really isn't the best way to describe what we're trying to do with defibrillation. We also weren't able to account for factors that have been previously shown to predict defibrillation success, right? So it's been shown that your compression depth prior to defibrillation predicts defibrillation success, right? And rate and depth also predict survival, right? Similarly, right, another big thing that's been talked about in the literature a lot, pre-shock pause. It's predictive of defibrillation success, ROSC, and survival. And again, we didn't have waveform data, so we couldn't calculate that. So in addition to all the limitations of observational data, right, we have residual confounding from the confounders that we identified. We have maybe unmeasured confounders that weren't included in the data set, or unknown confounders. These are certainly on that list, right? And so those are, I think, some of the most important limitations to highlight within the confines of the time we have. I know we're coming up to the end of our time. Really quick conclusion. So initial defibrillation dose was not associated with any outcome in the study, regardless of the monitor that was used, right? Waveform type overall also did not predict outcome. In our statistical models, if you're going to take one thing away from all my rambling today, time to defibrillation is the most important predictor of outcome. And as always, more research is needed, right? We need to understand in a prospective way, maybe the first defibrillation dose doesn't matter, but maybe subsequent dose escalation does, right? For instance, maybe there's a certain population of patients that can be identified by things like, you can take waveform characteristics from your first rhythm analysis and then predict whether a patient is going to be shock refractory or not and modulate your energy based on that. So there's certainly more work to be done here, but this is certainly some preliminary evidence that suggests that if you're going to be worrying about how you're performing defibrillation, energy isn't really something that should be on your mind. Yeah, thank you very much.
Amazing. Tanner, I've learned something about the directed acyclic graph. I was not expecting that, I got to be honest. I have a few questions for you. So, obviously amazing presentation, and it brings up a couple of questions. And number one for me is, should we be standardizing the first shock dose based on the fact that, hey, maybe it doesn't really matter? We see a lot of people doing different things. We see escalating. I think most of us are at the max. do you have any comments on, if it truly doesn't really matter, should we just be saying do this?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think any amount of brain power, right? We have limited kind of cognitive abilities in the context of a cardiac arrest. Any amount of brain power that's thinking about adjusting the dose I think that that's wasted mental energy, right? And we should be focusing on the things that do really matter. Again, and I think the resuscitation guidelines that exist are very reasonable, right? Use the max that's available on the defibrillator that you have. Right. I guess another important side that I didn't really talk about in this is there's real no evidence of harm either in our analyses, right? That there's always concern that maybe really high defibrillation energies or cumulative exposure to defibrillation energies across the course of an arrest are going to harm people. As far as I'm aware, there's really no rigorous data that that there's any dose that's clinically available on our monitors that causes harm, right? In the laboratory setting, right? If you deliver, 15 joules per kilo, yes, I agree, you could probably cause harm. But yeah, I think standardizing it, max dose for your defibrillator is reasonable.
Okay, good. I'm glad you said, I'm going to go to Dr. Pepe in a minute, but I want to circle back around to that comment with respect to double sequential. But Dr. Pepe, go ahead.
You unmute. Did I unmute?
Yes, you're
Did
good.
I unvideo? Okay, got it. Hey, just Standard, first of all, I'm so pleased because you guys were very thoroughly thinking about, multi-factor, so many multi-factors that are involved here. And in the statistical analysis you use help with that. It's not perfect, but it gets you in the right direction. So thank you for that great work, because this is a very thoughtfully done analysis. The other thing I was going to tell you, this is more of a fun thing. Like, so years ago, we started with these new things called biphasic defibrillators, and we put them in the airport in Chicago because I had taught the Surgeon General and his team how to do defibrillation and how AEDs could work. And he said, we need these, but then the government, whatever accounting office said, we need to have a study. So we decided to go study it, and we went to the airport in Chicago. What was fascinating is that first year we had 9 people that went down the ticket counter gate areas. And how many of those do you think survived? What do you think? Then that first year, 9 people in the ticket counter. And I'll give you a bias. 6 of the people who operated them had never seen an AED before. They had just heard about it. Maybe they'd never been trained in it or seen it. So what do you think? How many of those survived?
I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to say all of them.
All 9 did survive the first year. Now, here's where I'm leading to, though, and this has to do with this to your paper, is that the second year, though, we had 2 or 3 people, I think, that did not survive. Okay, and they still remained in VF there on campus. So the point is, this is a thing where we got the people within 2 or 3 minutes. We're able to shock them right away. So it goes to takes a little bit of time factor out for you. But now it turned out that that's where I always like to do. I drill down and say what was going on, and turned out all 3 or whoever it was, I think it was 2 or 3, were obese diabetics. It's very interesting, right? So we actually were saying, is that a weight-based thing, a chest wall compliance, a resistance thing that you were bringing out, which is absolutely important that you talked about, is that the transthoracic resistance, but or was it something about the vasovasorum of a diabetic, et cetera? And we were leaning now later that it has to do with the physiological underlying processes, which are very hard to measure or identify, but that's part of it. But I think that's the only reason I'm bringing it up is that you guys have attempted to do that in a very nice way here, and it continues on, and but it's much more complicated than just what you see. But I think in the end, I think the great part is that whatever one you're bringing, just do it quickly, right? Right. So that's
Yeah.
what. I mean, I hope I didn't get too long-winded, but this struck, resonated with me because of those early studies we did. So
That actually sparks a couple of great questions, Paul. So I want to go with the first one, and Tanner, you mentioned it, and Dr. Pepe mentioned it. Should one of our KPIs, our key performance indicators, as medical directors, as EMS leaders, as CQI leaders, should we be looking at the time to first shock? I know that we have started to do that here in our agencies, and we've kind of made it like a little bit of a competition as we put out the reports. We actually show how fast it took you to get those pads on and shock that patient, which is oftentimes very long. And I know that was mentioned in the paper, but is that something that coming out of this paper is like really the top item for you
Yeah. So
coming out of this?
So and there is some data on that actually. So I think it's often conceptualized that, the time to first shock, if you're decreasing that is more of a system level thing, right? Making sure you have public access AED programs, making sure that your dispatchers are recognizing cardiac arrest and dispatching fire and loss so they can get defibrillators on the chest faster. Um, but there is evidence that once EMS arrives on scene, even for patients who present with initial VF, there are significant delays to defibrillation. So there was a study that was done, and this was an agency, I believe, in Virginia, right? It wasn't like New York or somewhere where there's a lot of really tall high rises where after you park the ambulance you have to go up 30 floors. It was kind of more generalizable to a lot of the systems that we work in, that found that from curb to the first defibrillation for patients who presented with VF, it was almost an average 7-minute delay.
Yeah.
Right. And so actually using dispatch times, on-scene times, and then actually looking at your monitor files to see how quick that first shock was delivered is crucial. Right.
Yes.
And not just saying, because, a lot of times, right, you look at an EHR and it's like, yeah, we got on scene and 2 minutes later they document the defibrillation. It's like, when did that really happen?
Yeah.
Right. And some of it's unavoidable. Right. If you got the patient's wedged between the toilet and the bathtub and you got to move them out to an area where you can actually work them, or you got to kick down a door, like, there are extenuating circumstances. But I think that, the post contact or post on scene delays are not insignificant. Right. So I could not support monitoring that metric more. I think that is incredibly important. Yeah.
Yeah. So just for everyone on the call, you take the time that you were at patient, which is in your EPCR. Look at the time that your defibrillator was started and the first shock was given, and that's the time. So those numbers are available. They're just not available in the same location oftentimes. You just got to do the math on it. And that's something that we actually have added into our CQI. The other thing I wanted to ask you, and a few other people have asked questions, but I want to get a couple of these in, which is the time to amiodarone. When you look at some recent data, they're showing that 8 minutes is that mark too. So were you able to look at the dose of the antidysrhythmic and the timing of that dose in these particular cases, I wonder?
Yeah, so the reason that we did not include antiarrhythmics in this study was, and this is similar to why we draw those diagrams, right? So the dose of antiarrhythmic that is administered is dependent on the first shock. So if your first shock works, you might never get amiodarone. Right. And so if we tried to do subgroup analyses looking at just patients who got amiodarone, that kind of distorts the relationship between the association and the outcome. Because ideally, we won't be giving our patients amiodarone because our first shock will be so effective, right? And same with dose, right? The patient who, if you fail that first shock, we know that failing the first shock makes refractory VF much more likely, right?
Yeah.
And so, if and we didn't find this, but if we found that there was one dose that was much more effective, those patients are just by default are going to have a lower dose and less frequently going to get amiodarone. I am also, in general, a little bit skeptical of some of these studies that look at drug timing, because, right, in these statistical models, the patients who got the drugs early also had great veins because it was easy to get vascular access. They probably had some crack paramedics that were really good, right? They also probably, if you're giving amiodarone early, you probably got everything else done, right? So they got early airway management. They got, they might have had better CPR, right? More experienced teams. You might have had more people on scene, which we know is associated with better outcomes. And, so anyway, long story short, the timing of the drugs thing, I'm very skeptical of it. And in fact, probably the best data on the heterogeneity between drug timing and outcome comes from Paramedic 2. And they didn't find any statistically significant heterogeneity between epi and placebo.
Right.
In their IVIO studies that they did after that, they kind of said, well, if you look at kind of the unadjusted curves, right, you see that the epi survival is higher when you get epi early, like the curves are kind of separated early, but they're not significantly separated, right? From a statistical standpoint, they're not really different, right? So
Although the average paramedic 2, the average time to epi was 21 and a half minutes
yeah,
after 911 call.
I
Right.
agree.
So
I agree. Yeah,
no one's going to come back there, right?
if
But
epi works, it probably works early, right? From a physiologic perspective, it makes sense. It's just the estimates that we get from observational studies that look at these relationships, I'm a little skeptical of, right?
Well, if you're skeptical of that, you're probably skeptical then of the IV versus IO amio. We've changed our protocols to say IV preferred now. And we've removed the epi altogether for the shockables, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. I mean, again, yeah, I agree, right? It's, there's good physiologic rationale. It's lipophilic, right? It's, so I get the reason, but we know sicker patients
Yeah.
just get IO drugs, right? So,
Right. That's
um,
true. I know. And there are people who are agreeing with you in the chat. It says, so Larry asked, Tanner, did you find a time after which the survival really dropped off?
yeah, and our estimates are very similar to other published estimates, right? So it was, and I actually just talked about this in a presentation to a local agency the other day. So in our study, for every single minute that elapsed between dispatch and defibrillation, the odds of ROSC dropped by about 7%, and your odds of survival dropped by about 10%, right? And so, right, it's a continually decreasing
Yeah.
a quasi-linear relationship between time to defibrillation and outcomes. And again, right, a little beyond the scope of this analysis, like did we find a point in time at which defibrillation had no benefit, right? You might as well not even shock them because they're dead. Like we didn't do any of that.
Okay.
But yeah, I hope
Okay.
that answers the question.
Yeah, I did. George says, great presentation. Are there any other studies compared to this one in other countries like Europe? And I'll point out the Netherlands, which has they have a tripling of neurointact survival. We have 8%, they have 24%. And so, great question by George. Is there a population difference here? I mean, I know you didn't look at that; it was only U.S. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, as far as I know, right? So no data, nobody's looked at this exact question in Europe. The study that I cited that looks at LifePak versus Zoll, that was with the Danish cardiac arrest registry. So in Denmark, they looked at whether waveform matters, right? Using monitor as a proxy for waveform, and found no difference. So actually, and I said, again, I fully acknowledge that maybe there's a paper I could have missed that kind of looked at a similar question, but the draft ERC guidelines that are going to be released on October 22nd say a little bit about this, and they cite our paper is the only one that's really looked at this.
Wow.
So as far as I know, I do not believe that there's anyone that's looked at this in Europe. Although I hope that people do.
Yeah, they should. Now I have another question here, and I'm gonna ask it based on an image I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna have you comment on this. Okay. Oh, wait. There it is, right here. Okay. So this is from CARES 2024. This is from their annual report that I pulled. And on the bottom, they don't tell you the agency, but these are all agencies that have over 200 CARES submissions in that year. And you can see all the way to the left, you have about a 3.8% overall survival, and you look all the way to the right, and you're almost at 22%. Okay. So when you're looking at your data set of 500,000 records, but then you look here amongst these agencies where clearly there's what is it, like a 6 or 7-fold difference.
Mhm.
How do you explain this? And B, in your paper, in the discussion of your paper, you say that, yes, it's probably not the dose, but it's probably everything else. Is this the everything else that we're seeing as to why there's such a big disparity between very large agencies across this country?
Yeah, so I would say that the source of variation, a lot of it is predictable, right? So we have demographic variables that we can't control, right? Age, sex, whether your cardiac arrest was witnessed or not, the general health of your population. In addition, there's probably some bias with, you know, what patients agencies choose to resuscitate, right? So there are some agencies that are more aggressive and might, give every unwitnessed asystole 15 minutes of ACLS versus not. So that's some of it. And then I'd say a lot of the risk is everything else, right? It is what is your CPR quality? What's your time to defibrillation, I'd say is probably one of the strongest predictors in this model. Or if you created a model to explain this disparity, that would be like number one.
Okay.
So I'd say it's some blend of that. I mean, so much has been published on kind of the epidemiology of cardiac arrest and predictors of cardiac arrest. I do suspect a large portion of this can be explained by some mixture of demographic variables and then process of care variables, like the everything else, right? Pre-shock pause, time to defibrillation, CPR quality, all of that.
Okay. Yeah, because we're kind of lumping in kind of everything, but then when you look across the board, and I think it's maybe on the earlier slide, here it is, where you have a huge statewide variation, right? So
Right.
you got Washington State at the top, over 14%, Vermont at the very bottom. And it kind of makes you wonder here, what are those states doing differently? I mean, if I had it my way, all of this data would be transparent. So
Yep.
that we could actually learn from the agency who's up at 22%, or let's say the agency whose neurointact survival is 14, 15, 16% versus the ones that are at the average of 8.3%. I would love for I know that we have a lot of other really smart folks on this call. I would love to hear your thoughts for Tanner. So go ahead and oh, I see Lou. Chief, go ahead.
So first of all, Peter, you're absolutely right. Time from patient contact to first defibrillation and to epinephrine are important to track. We know if epi is going to work at all, not necessarily for the shockable, that the sooner the better. When you talk about 20 minutes, it's a waste of anything. Tanner, just thank you for doing this stuff so the rest of us don't have to. But both of you, thinking hats on, pediatrics. So there's different doses. Europe does, they start at 4 joules per kilogram, AHA 2 to 4 joules. There was a study ILCOR referenced that said there was no difference from 1.5 to 2.5. Thoughts on that as far as this extending to peds?
I'm always a bigger is better, and especially in the kids. I mean, when you look at a myocyte, and I think Tanner kind of alluded to it earlier, but if you plink off a couple of myocytes, you're probably going to be okay. Which is obviously there are a lot of people who are living with you know heart muscle that's not perfect, and they're living a great life, right? When you look at the double sequential information, and Tanner alluded to the current, to the impedance, I mean, it'd be really nice to have seen. Obviously, you don't have the PCO files, but to see what the impedance is, because now a lot of us are doing AP placement. So I think AP placement, higher dosing, 360 dosing, which is what dual sequential really is. I think is better. So I think that the future would be, and we just got our case report published of the very first double sequential on the very first shock. The guy walked out of the hospital. 4 studies going on in Europe right now looking at double sequential moving to the second dose, the second shock. So to answer your question, I think the future is higher dosing and then dual sequential for everybody early, even as early as the first shock. And I think we're going to have to wait for these RCTs to be published. They're coming soon. So that would be my answer. Tanner, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so and again, this has not been peer reviewed or published, but I did try to look at kids with VF and ESO and do this question: do you start with 2 joules? Do you start with 4? So first of all, right, kids rarely get defibrillated in the context
Right.
of cardiac arrest. They're almost
Right.
always systole PEA, and when they do get shocked, oftentimes it's the one that like you do 10 minutes of CPR and you give some epi and then they fibrillate, right? So I don't think that's a real true test of the question, right? The VF that occurs after a prolonged resuscitation because you gave a bunch
Yeah.
of epi, I don't think that's something that
Right.
is important to terminate necessarily, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, or the V, like there are people who will see VF after a drowning. That's they're 5-10 minutes on scene and then they see VF. I mean, the VF Lou that you're talking about, and in Palm Beach County we do 4-4-10. That's what we do. But and we had a kid who he ended up having prolonged QT, and we got him out on the first shock again. That's the one case, right, that you hear about, but you have the kids who have Brugada, you have the kids who have other channelopathies. Um, and again, all these dosing recommendations, they come from animals,
yeah,
right? These aren't they aren't like doing a randomized controlled trial on children that they're putting into VF. That would
right.
be bad.
Yeah,
But
and a kid who drowned, right? The acidosis and all like
yeah.
the physiologic substrate is very different than a laboratory cell, like an animal with an electrically induced VF, for like how they do some of these models.
Yeah, yeah. Before we go, I don't see any other hands. Tanner, I just want to let everyone here know that the Florida chapter of the NMSP, we're having a big dinner on the Friday night in Tampa for the national conference, and you are our guest speaker. And what you're going to be speaking about is the fact that your dissertation you aren't going to be formally a PhD just yet. You explained that to me, but can you just give us a little preview of what you're going to be talking about? I want to entice people to come to the meeting, become an NASP member, and come to the free dinner. It's going to be sponsored. Go ahead, tell us.
Yeah, so at that point I'll have essentially like written my dissertation, like the actual physical document, so it'll be in kind of final form. And so, and then coming up in the spring, I'm gonna be defending, right? The public defense where I get up in front of the university and have the floor for an hour to talk about what I found during my dissertation. So essentially the talk at the dinner will be a version of that. So my dissertation comprises of like a series of 8 or 9 papers that look at different aspects of cardiac arrest care that I've written over the past 3 or 4 years. And so we'll be talking about what supraglottic airway to use during cardiac arrest. We're going to be talking about the location of IO access devices, post-ROSC, right? Which pressor should we be using, epi versus norepi? Maybe I'll briefly touch on at the risk of having you guys hear it again, touch a bit on defibrillation dose, talk about some of a comparison of some observational work we did on amiodarone and lidocaine, and contrast that with some of the randomized data that has been published. And essentially just go through, again, my work from the past couple years and talk about some future directions and relevance to EMS care. And hopefully be engaging, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, well, you will be very engaging, and I will say that we've secured a beautiful room, very high up, overlooking Tampa. It's going to be a great menu, and we'll have the whole setup for you. And from the sounds of it, we probably should get it recorded, so we could put it up on the YouTube channel. But we really appreciate it. Looking forward to you presenting there. Anybody else have any other comments for Tanner before we jump off and go to, let me get Dr. Pepe's webinar information right here, so you guys can jump over to the Eagles webinar. There we go. It's coming. Eagles webinar right there. Awesome. All right. And where I see something that says Beth E, Julius E. I see a bunch of people there. Who's that? I'm curious. Ah, that's Ingram and Alter. Hey guys. And our fellows, and there's Terry. Okay, good. All right. I got a powerhouse over there. Good to see you guys. Appreciate you guys coming on. All right. All right, everybody. We'll see you guys. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Thanks, Tanner. Great job, man. Unbelievable. See ya.